Egan's life was seemingly perfect. Her world revolved around the safety and comfort of her home, a place where everything felt just right. She grew up idolizing her father, Neil, who was not only the provider but the rock that held their family together. He was the kind of man who always seemed to know what to do, always present, always caring. For as long as Egan could remember, he was her hero, a father who took her hand when she was scared, taught her to ride a bike, and helped with school projects. Her mother, Silas, was the heart of the home. She nurtured the family with love, patience, and endless care. Every meal was thoughtfully prepared, every holiday meticulously planned to ensure it would be a memorable experience. Together, Neil and Silas seemed like a team no one could break, a duo that defied the odds of modern marriages. They had laughter, they had stability, and most importantly, they had each other. Growing up, Egan felt fortunate. Her friends' families seemed fractured compared to hers, and she often boasted about how perfect her parents' relationship was. Her family became her model of what love and commitment should look like. Everything felt like it was in place, and as she matured, she found comfort in her connection with Neil. They had always been close, but as Egan grew older, their conversations deepened, reaching topics about life, dreams, and futures, conversations that sometimes felt more intimate than typical father-daughter exchanges. Yet, Egan didn't see it as unusual. After all, Neil had always been the one to listen when she needed someone. It was these moments that laid the foundation for Egan's growing discomfort. The changes were subtle at first, small gestures that she tried to overlook. He'd touch her arm lightly as they talked, let his hand rest on her back for a little longer than necessary. His compliments about her appearance grew more frequent, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her feel self-conscious. Egan tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. After all, this was her father. The man who had raised her, who had loved her unconditionally. There was no reason to believe anything was wrong. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. The more she tried to push these feelings aside, the more they seemed to grow. She'd catch herself analyzing every interaction with Neil, wondering if she was imagining the tension that now seemed to fill the room whenever they were alone. She'd laugh off his lingering touches, tell herself it was just a father being affectionate. But she couldn't shake the discomfort. It hung over her like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. Signs of something unspoken. And it wasn't just Egan who noticed the change. Her mother, Silas, had always been the calm, steady presence in their household, but lately her demeanor had shifted. Silas had become more withdrawn, her once warm affection towards Egan replaced by a growing distance. There was a tension in the house, one that neither Egan nor her parents wanted to acknowledge. Egan began to feel like she was caught in the middle of something invisible yet palpable. Silas would watch her when she interacted with Neil, her eyes filled with something Egan couldn't quite place: suspicion, maybe, or fear. There were times when Egan caught her mother staring, as though trying to decipher a code she hadn't yet cracked. The family dinners, once filled with laughter and conversation, became strained, the air between them thick with unspoken words and uneasy glances. Silas never said anything outright, but Egan could feel the weight of her mother's growing doubts. It was in the way she'd cut conversations short, the way she avoided eye contact when Neil entered the room. Egan began to dread the time she spent with her father, not because of anything he said or did, but because of the way Silas looked at her when they were together. It was as if her mother could sense the shift too, and the unspoken suspicions only deepened the chasm that was slowly forming between them all. The tension came to a head one evening, after yet another quiet dinner. Egan had retreated to her room, trying to find solace in the familiarity of her space when there was a knock at her door. It was her mother, her face pale, her eyes tired with the weight of whatever had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Can I talk to you?" Silas asked quietly, stepping into the room without waiting for an answer. Egan nodded, unsure of what to expect. Silas stood there for a moment, as if trying to gather the courage to say what was on her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling, but her words were sharp. "Has anything been going on between you and your father? Anything strange?" The question hit Egan like a punch to the gut. She froze, her mind racing as she tried to process what her mother was asking. Did she know? Could she sense the same unease that Egan had been feeling? "No," Egan said quickly, her voice shaky. "Nothing's going on." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Nothing had happened, not really. But there was something off, something wrong, and both she and her mother knew it. Silas looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. It was as if she was trying to decide whether or not to believe her daughter. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own suspicions.
"I just needed to ask," she said softly, turning to leave the room.
But as she walked away, Egan could feel the cracks widening. There was no going back now. Whatever had once held their family together was starting to fall apart, and Egan was powerless to stop it. It was a quiet evening, and the tension in the house was unbearable. Egan sat in her room, trying to read, but her mind kept drifting back to the uncomfortable feelings she had been suppressing for weeks. Her mother, Silas, had grown distant, and Egan could sense the unease hanging over the house like a dark cloud. Neil, her father, was trying to act as if everything was normal, but Egan knew better. She could feel the shift in the way he looked at her, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, even when he said nothing. That evening, the air felt thick with something unsaid. After dinner, Silas approached Egan in the hallway, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. Egan could see the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, the weight of suspicions and fears that had been building up inside her. "Egan," Silas said softly, her voice barely a whisper, but firm with the intent of the question she was about to ask. "I need to talk to you." Egan's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it coming, the confrontation she had been dreading, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. She nodded silently and followed her mother into the living room. Neil was still sitting at the dining table, pretending to be engrossed in the evening news, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. He knew something was coming too. Silas stood in the middle of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. She didn't look at Egan at first. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what she had to say. "I've noticed things," she began, her voice strained. "Things between you and your father." Egan's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her mother's gaze finally land on her, sharp and full of the questions she didn't want to answer. "What things?" Egan asked, her voice shaky, even though she knew exactly what her mother meant. Silas took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she searched Egan's face for the truth. "The way you two talk, the way you're always together, the way he looks at you, Egan, something isn't right." Egan felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. She had been telling herself for so long that she was imagining things, that the tension between her and Neil was nothing more than a figment of her own insecurities. But hearing her mother say it out loud, hearing the accusation, it made everything real. Too real. "There's nothing going on," Egan said quickly, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "Mom, you're overreacting." But Silas wasn't convinced. Her eyes filled with something between anger and heartbreak, a pain so raw that Egan could barely stand to look at her. "You think I don't see it? The way he touches you, the way he lingers when he's around you." Silas's voice cracked with emotion. "This isn't just in my head, Egan. I know something's wrong." Egan's throat tightened as the words sank in. She wanted to deny it, to reassure her mother that everything was fine. But the truth was, she didn't know if it was. The way Neil had been acting, the way he made her feel, it was confusing, overwhelming, and something she hadn't been able to fully process. "Mom, please," Egan said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Nothing has happened. He's my father." Silas shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "He may be your father, but the way he's acting isn't right. You know that, don't you?" Egan didn't have an answer. She could feel her mother's hurt, her fear, but she was too lost in her own confusion to offer any comfort. Suddenly, Neil's voice broke through the tension. "Silas, that's enough," he said, his tone calm but laced with frustration. He stood up from the table and walked toward them, his face hard, but his eyes flickered with something Egan couldn't quite place. Guilt? Maybe? Fear? "You're blowing this out of proportion," Neil continued. "Nothing is going on. She's our daughter. How could you even think such a thing?" Silas turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "I think it because I see it, Neil. I see the way you look at her. Don't stand there and pretend like I'm crazy." Neil's face twisted in anger, But there was something else there too, something that made Egan's stomach churn. "I love her," he said, his voice softer now, but the words hung in the air like a weight too heavy to carry. "But not in the way you're thinking." Silas let out a bitter laugh, her tears finally spilling over. "Not in the way I'm thinking. Then how, Neil? How?" The room fell silent, the tension between them so thick Egan could barely breathe. She wanted to run, to escape the crushing weight of everything falling apart around her, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, caught between her parents, between the truth and the lies they were telling themselves. "Stop it," Egan whispered, her voice shaking as she finally found the courage to speak. "Please, just stop." But it was too late. The words had already been said, and there was no going back. Silas turned away from them both, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I can't do this anymore," she said softly. "I'm leaving." Neil's face fell, the anger draining out of him as the realization hit. "Silas, wait." But she was already walking away, her footsteps heavy with the weight of a decision she had made long before this night. Egan watched her mother leave, feeling the cracks in their family grow wider with every step she took. And just like that, the perfect family Egan had once known was shattered. There was no fixing it now, no going back. Neil stood there in the silence, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Egan didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fix what had just happened. For a long time, they stood there in the ruins of what had once been a home filled with love, and neither of them spoke. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house was unbearable. Egan felt like she was walking on a tightrope, careful with every word, every movement. Her relationship with her father, Neil, had grown increasingly strained, even though they both tried to act like nothing was wrong. But deep down, Egan knew that the invisible line between them had been crossed, even if nothing truly inappropriate had happened. Her father's lingering looks, the way he sought out her presence, it all weighed on her in a way that made her stomach churn. Her mother, Silas, had become a shadow of the woman she once was. She no longer smiled, no longer filled the house with warmth. The love that once bound the family together had frayed into threads of suspicion and fear. Silas had confronted Egan about her relationship with Neil, but even after Egan had denied anything was happening, the doubts lingered. The trust that once seemed unbreakable was gone, replaced by an oppressive sense of betrayal that neither Egan nor Silas knew how to face. Then, one evening, everything finally came to a head. It was late, and Egan was in her room, trying to lose herself in a book, though she couldn't focus. The house was quiet, too quiet. Her mother and father had barely spoken to each other in days. She had tried to avoid being alone with Neil as much as possible, but the silence that now dominated the house was suffocating. Suddenly, raised voices drifted up from downstairs. Egan's heart skipped a beat. She crept toward her bedroom door, opening it just a crack so she could hear more clearly. Her parents were arguing in the living room, their voices low but sharp. "I can't do this anymore," Neil Silas was saying, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've tried, I've really tried, but I can't pretend that everything is okay." Neil's response was muffled, but Egan could hear the frustration in his voice. "Silas, you're being paranoid. Nothing is going on. She's our daughter, for God's sake." "You think I don't see it?" Silas shot back, her voice rising. "The way you look at her, the way you act around her, it's not normal, Neil. Something has changed, and you know it." Egan's chest tightened as she listened. She felt sick to her stomach, torn between the truth and the lies that were unraveling in front of her. "I love her," Neil said, his voice softer now, but the words cut through the air like a knife. "But not in the way you're accusing me of. She's my daughter, Silas. I would never hurt her." Silas let out a bitter laugh, and Egan could hear the tears in her mother's voice. "You already have, Neil. Whether you want to admit it or not, you've crossed a line." Egan felt frozen, unable to move, unable to stop the flood of emotions washing over her. She wanted to run down the stairs, to stop the argument, to fix the cracks that had torn her family apart. But how could she fix something that had been broken for so long? And then, there was a silence. A long, heavy silence that made Egan's skin crawl. She strained to hear what was happening, her heart pounding in her ears. When Neil spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe I have crossed a line. But it wasn't intentional, Silas. I never meant for things to get this far. Egan's breath caught in her throat. She felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. The admission, though not a direct confession, was enough to confirm what she had feared all along, that her father had feelings for her that went beyond what was appropriate, even if he hadn't acted on them. Silas's voice broke the silence, cold and hard. I'm leaving. Egan's heart raced as she heard the sound of footsteps. She knew what was happening. Her mother was finally leaving, and this time it was for good. She rushed out of her room and down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. When she reached the bottom, she saw Silas standing by the front door, a suitcase in hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce, filled with a determination that Egan hadn't seen in weeks. Mom, wait, Egan said, her voice shaking. You don't have to do this. Silas turned to look at her daughter, and for a moment the fierceness in her eyes softened. But it was only for a moment. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. I do, Egan, she said quietly. I can't stay here anymore. I can't live like this. Egan looked to Neil, who stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of regret and shame. He didn't say a word, didn't try to stop Silas from leaving. And then, in that moment of silence, the doorbell rang. Egan's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? Silas hesitated, her hand on the door before opening it. Standing in the doorway was a woman someone Egan had never seen before. She looked to be in her early 30s, with short dark hair and a serious expression on her face. There was something about her presence that immediately made the room feel colder. I'm sorry to come by so late, the woman said, her voice calm but firm. She looked past Silas and directly at Neil, but I'm afraid this can't wait any longer. Neil's face went pale, and for the first time that evening, Egan saw something in her father's eyes that terrified her fear. Who are you? Silas asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. The woman stepped inside, pulling a small badge from her pocket. Detective Harper, she said. I need to speak with Neil. It's about an ongoing investigation. Egan felt her blood run cold. An investigation? What could this possibly be about? I'm sorry, what investigation? Silas demanded, her eyes darting between the detective and Neil. Detective Harper's gaze didn't leave Neil as she spoke. There's been a complaint filed, she said, regarding inappropriate conduct with a minor. The room fell into a deafening silence. Egan's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She looked at Neil, hoping, praying that this was all some sort of mistake, that there was some explanation, but the look on her father's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. Neil Cooper, you're under arrest, Detective Harper said, stepping forward. You have the right to remain silent. Egan didn't hear the rest of the words. Her mind was spinning, her world crumbling around her. This wasn't just about the strange tension between her and her father. This was something far worse. As the detective led Neil out of the house in handcuffs, Egan stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her father, a man she had idolized for so long, was gone, taken away for something unspeakable. Silas collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, sobbing. Egan stood there in the silence, the weight of the truth crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her family was shattered, and there was no going back.